Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The tent fabric had frozen to itself in geometric patterns that shouldn't exist in nature. Thomas O'Brien stood 15 feet back from Madison Garcia's research site, his Garmin GPS confirming the coordinates she'd radioed in 5 days ago, but his 18 years of backcountry experience screaming that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the basic physics of this place. The November wind off Lake Superior carried a smell he'd never encountered in nearly 2 decades of rangering. Rot, yes, but underneath it something sharper, chemical, like burnt copper mixed with formaldehyde and wild game left too long in summer heat, except it was 32 degrees and everything should have been preserved by the cold. He'd taken the seaplane from Houghton that morning, the last flight before the lake froze solid for winter. Isle Royale National Park would be officially closed to visitors in 3 days, and Madison Garcia's research permit had another week before expiration. Her thesis advisor at Michigan Tech had called the ranger station yesterday, concerned that she'd missed 2 scheduled check-ins. Standard protocol. Thomas would hike the 4 miles from Rock Harbor to her research site on the Greenstone Ridge Trail, confirm she was okay, remind her about the check-in requirements, file the report. He'd done dozens of these welfare checks. They always ended the same way. Embarrassed graduate student, dead radio battery, profuse apologies. Except Madison's solar panels were still deployed, tilted at the optimal angle for the season. Her weather station blinked its green operational light. The satellite phone sat in its charging cradle, fully powered, next to her laptop. Everything functioned perfectly. Everything except Madison, who was nowhere in evidence, and the tent, which had been altered in ways that made Thomas's throat tighten with an instinct older than his training. He keyed his Motorola radio. Rock Harbor, this is O'Brien at Site 7 Delta. I've reached Garcia's camp. She's not present, over. Static, then Beth's voice. Copy that, Thomas. Signs of struggle? Thomas studied the scene with the methodical attention that had kept him alive through 2 decades of backcountry emergencies. Madison's boots sat outside the tent, laces tied, arranged with the precision of someone who intended to return. Her red North Face jacket hung from a branch, still zipped. The camp stove held a pot with 3 inches of ice. She'd been heating water when she left in her thermal layers in 32-degree weather without boots or coat, heating water she never drank. Negative on struggle, Thomas said, forcing his voice into the professional monotone that kept panic at bay. But something's wrong. She left without essential gear. I'm going to process the scene and start a preliminary search grid. Over. Copy. Weather's turning. You've got maybe 4 hours before the front hits. Over. Thomas clipped the radio to his belt and approached the tent. The geometric ice patterns weren't random. They formed symbols, repeating designs that his mind tried to interpret as frost crystals, but his gut recognized as something arranged, purposeful. Circles within circles, branching lines that looked almost like antlers or root systems or veins. He photographed them with his digital camera, the timestamp reading 2:47 p.m., November 18, 2008. The tent zipper was closed. He pulled it open. Madison's sleeping bag lay on top of her cot, perfectly smooth, unslept in. Her research journals were stacked beside her laptop, corners aligned with military precision. Her field guides formed a second stack, tallest to shortest. Her collection vials, she'd been studying wolf scat for her dissertation, stood in 3 rows, arranged by date, all samples accounted for. But the tent's back wall had been scraped from the inside. Long gouges in the nylon made by something sharp, dragged downward in parallel sets of 4. The marks went through the tent fabric and scored the plastic ground cloth underneath. Thomas knelt, studying the gouges. Not knife cuts, too irregular. Not bear claws, wrong pattern. And no bear would work from inside a sealed tent. The spacing matched human fingernails, if human fingernails were thick enough and sharp enough to tear through expedition-grade nylon like tissue paper. He found the blood on the ground cloth when he pulled back the sleeping bag. Not splatter, Not pooling. 7 drops, perfectly circular, arranged in a crescent shape. The blood had frozen black. Thomas took samples with the evidence kit he carried for poaching investigations, sealed them in plastic bags, logged the GPS coordinates. His hands remained steady through the procedure. His training held. But something under his sternum had begun to twist. A sensation he associated with the 3 times in his career he'd found bodies in the backcountry. That preemptive grief. That knowledge that the story would not end well. The sky had darkened to charcoal when Thomas emerged from the tent. The front Beth warned about was moving faster than predicted, clouds rolling across Lake Superior like something solid, something with weight and intention. The temperature had dropped 6 degrees in the 20 minutes he'd spent inside. His breath came out in thick plumes that hung in the air longer than they should, vapor that seemed reluctant to dissipate. He established his search grid using the tent as the central point, working outward in concentric circles, standard search and rescue protocol. First circle, 50 feet. He found Madison's socks at the 40-foot mark, both of them, placed side by side on a flat rock. They'd been removed carefully, no signs of tearing. They were frozen solid. Second circle, 100 feet. He found her thermal shirt hanging from a low branch, arms spread as if crucified. The fabric was intact, no rips, no blood. She'd unbuttoned it and taken it off while walking, hung it deliberately, in 32-degree weather, without a coat. Thomas documented each find, but his training was beginning to fracture around the edges. He'd seen hypothermia cases before, paradoxical undressing where victims remove their clothes as they freeze to death, convinced they're overheating. But paradoxical undressing was chaotic, frenzied. Madison's clothes had been removed and arranged with calm precision. Third circle, 150 feet. The trail crossed a small creek, ice forming along the banks. Thomas found her thermal pants on the far side, folded neatly on a stump. The fabric was clean, no signs of distress. She'd taken them off, folded them, placed them, and continued walking. Continued walking toward the interior, toward the higher elevations, toward the densest section of old-growth forest where the wolves denned. Continued walking, apparently, in nothing but her underwear, in near-freezing temperatures without food or water or light, 5 days ago. Thomas stood at the creek crossing, his headlamp cutting a weak cone through the gathering darkness, and felt something he hadn't felt since his first winter in the backcountry, the forest watching him. Not the passive observation of wildlife, the casual notice of a deer or coyote registering human presence. This was different, focused, hungry, patient, the kind of attention a predator gives prey it has already decided to kill. He keyed his radio. "Beth, this is O'Brien. I need a full SR team at first light. We've got a critical missing person, evidence of paradoxical undressing, trail heading northeast toward Feltman Ridge. Over." The static lasted longer than it should have. When Beth's voice finally came through, it was tight with concern. "Thomas, the weather's scrubbing flights for the next 48 hours. Earliest we can get a team to you is Thursday morning. Can you continue the search? Over." Thursday was 3 days away. Madison Garcia had been missing for 5 days, walking into the wilderness in her underwear in November in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The chances of finding her alive had been remote when he'd arrived. Now they were approaching 0. "Copy that," Thomas said. "I'll continue the search as long as conditions permit. Over." He didn't mention that conditions were already deteriorating past the safety margins. He didn't mention the symbols in the frost, or the methodical removal of clothing, or the attention he felt pressing against his back like cold fingers. He had a job to do. 18 years of experience told him Madison Garcia was almost certainly dead, but until he found a body, he would search. The trail Madison had taken led upslope, away from the established paths, into the sections of Isle Royale that hadn't been logged in the 19th century. Old white pines rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy blocking what little remained of the daylight. Thomas followed her tracks, barefoot impressions in the half-frozen soil, impossibly clear, as if she'd walked this path yesterday instead of 5 days ago. The tracks were evenly spaced, unhurried, No signs of stumbling or confusion. She'd walked with purpose. After half a mile, Thomas found her bra hanging from a branch at eye level. The clasp had been undone normally, no tearing. She'd removed it while walking and placed it where it would be visible to anyone following her trail. She'd left a trail for someone to follow. Thomas photographed the garment, logged the GPS coordinates, and felt the first real prickle of fear work through his professional detachment. Madison Garcia hadn't succumbed to hypothermia-induced confusion. She'd walked into this forest deliberately, removing her clothes piece by piece, leaving markers for pursuers. The question was whether she'd been fleeing something or being drawn by something. The tracks continued upslope. Thomas followed, his headlamp beam dancing across tree trunks that seemed to lean inward, creating tunnels instead of clearings. The wind had died completely, an ominous sign this close to a frontal passage. The air felt thick, resistant, like walking through something denser than atmosphere. His ears popped twice, though his altimeter showed he'd only climbed 70 feet. A sound reached him through the dead air, rhythmic, percussive, like wood striking wood. Thomas froze, hand dropping to the canister of bear spray on his belt. The sound came again, 3 deliberate strikes echoing from upslope. Then silence. "Madison?" His voice fell flat, absorbed by the trees without echo. "Madison Garcia, this is Park Ranger Thomas O'Brien. If you can hear me, call out. I'm here to help." No response. The silence felt active, intentional, like someone holding their breath just beyond his headlamp's reach. Thomas continued upslope, his pace slowing, every instinct he'd honed over 18 years screaming at him to return to the tent, to wait for daylight, to not proceed alone into this place where the shadows moved wrong and the air tasted like copper and decay. But Madison Garcia was out here, had been out here for 5 days, and protocol demanded he search until conditions made search impossible. He found her underwear 200 feet farther up the trail, torn this time, shredded as if removed in haste or violence. Dark stains across the fabric that could have been blood or soil or both. The fabric was frozen stiff. Thomas bagged it with hands that had started to tremble, not from cold but from the certainty that whatever had happened to Madison Garcia had happened right here, at this specific point on the trail, where the tree trunks bore fresh scratches at shoulder height, parallel gouges in the bark that matched the marks inside her tent. The tracks beyond this point changed. Her barefoot impressions became irregular, toes digging in, signs of running. She'd fled from this spot, sprinting upslope, and 20 feet farther he found where she'd fallen. The impact of her body pressed into the half-frozen earth. But she'd gotten up and continued, because her tracks led onward. And now there were other tracks beside hers. Thomas knelt beside the new tracks, his headlamp illuminating prints that made his training fail completely. They were human-shaped, heel, arch, 5 toes, but elongated, stretched, each foot nearly 18 inches long. The toes ended in points that had sunk deep into the soil. The stride length suggested something moving on 2 legs but covering ground faster than any human could run. And there were dozens of these tracks, surrounding Madison's prints, pacing her, herding her upslope toward something Thomas could see now in the distance. A clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle, where the snow on the ground showed dark patches that might have been soil or might have been something else. Thomas's radio crackled. "Brian, do you copy? Thomas, what's your status? Over." He grabbed the radio, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "Beth, I've found tracks. Multiple individuals, possibly following the missing person. I'm going to need law enforcement backup. Over." "Thomas, you're breaking up. Say again." "Over." He repeated the message, but the radio spat static, words fragmenting into noise. The batteries were fresh that morning. His equipment was professional grade. The radio should have worked perfectly. Reading, immediate. Then silence. The radio was dead. Thomas tried the satellite phone. No signal. His GPS still functioned, still showed his coordinates, but the mapping overlay had stopped loading. He was alone on this island in the dark, following tracks that belonged to something that shouldn't exist. He should have retreated. Every protocol, Every training manual, every briefing on backcountry safety said to break off the search when conditions deteriorated. But Madison Garcia's tracks led into that clearing, and 18 years of training couldn't completely override the fundamental instinct that had made Thomas choose this job. Someone was in trouble, and leaving them was not acceptable. He approached the clearing with his hand on the bear spray, knowing it would be useless against whatever had made those tracks, but needing the comfort of weight on his belt. The trees formed a perfect circle, 40 feet in diameter, their trunks bearing marks from some kind of tool or claw. The marks were old, weathered, carved decades or centuries ago. They showed the same repeating symbols he'd seen in the frost on Madison's tent, circles within circles, branching lines, antler root vein patterns that hurt to look at directly. The center of the clearing held a cairn, stones stacked 6 feet high, carefully balanced, impossibly old. The stones were covered in lichen and moss, but the top of the cairn was bare, and something rested there. A skull, whiter than bone should be, with antlers growing from the forehead, antlers that branched and rebranched in patterns that matched the symbols carved into the trees. Thomas's headlamp beam struck the skull and reflected wrong, the light bending, fragmenting, as if passing through ice. The air in the clearing was colder than the surrounding forest. His breath crystallized instantly, falling as snow. The temperature readout on his GPS showed 18 degrees, 14 degrees colder than it had been 100 yards back. And arranged around the cairn, forming a spiral that led from the edge of the clearing to the base of the stones, were pieces of Madison Garcia. Not all of her, not enough to constitute a body, just pieces. A hand still wearing her field watch, a foot, toenails painted blue, sections of torso with skin so pale it looked translucent. The pieces had been arranged deliberately, artistically, each one placed with precision, and they showed no signs of animal predation. The edges were too clean, too surgical. Thomas's training shattered completely. He staggered backward, his boot catching on a root, and he went down hard, landing in snow that was wrong. Snow that was red, not white. Snow that had frozen over something that pooled and congealed. He scrambled away from the clearing, his headlamp swinging wildly, and that's when he saw them. They stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the tree line, and there were 7 of them, or maybe 12, or maybe just one that existed in multiple places simultaneously. They were tall, impossibly tall, 8 or 9 feet, but hunched, bent, as if their spines had been broken and badly set. Their skin was gray-white, stretched over frames that showed every bone, every ridge, every hollow. Their arms were too long, hanging past their knees, ending in hands with fingers that had too many joints. Their heads were the worst, human skulls elongated, stretched with antlers growing from the temples, and eyes that reflected Thomas's headlamp beam with the flat shine of a predator's tapetum lucidum. One of them held something that might have been Madison Garcia's other hand, raising it to its mouth, teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, tearing into frozen flesh with sounds that Thomas would hear in every nightmare for the rest of his life. He ran. 18 years of backcountry experience should have meant controlled retreat, should have meant maintaining situational awareness, should have meant keeping his equipment. Instead, Thomas O'Brien ran like a terrified animal, crashing through undergrowth, his headlamp swinging wildly, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his throat. Behind him he heard movement, not the thundering pursuit of something chasing, but the patient, unhurried pace of something that knew he couldn't escape. His foot caught on a root and he went down, his headlamp flickering as he struck a tree trunk. Pain exploded through his shoulder, but fear overrode it, and he was up again, staggering downslope, trying to remember the route back to Madison's tent. His GPS was gone, lost in the fall. His radio was gone. He had his headlamp, his knife, and the bear spray that would be useless against what followed him through the dark. The things behind him weren't chasing him. They were hurting him, driving him deeper into the forest, away from the established trails, away from the routes that would lead back to Rock Harbor. Every time Thomas tried to angle left, toward where the shoreline should be, he heard movement in that direction, the crack of branches, the huff of breath. Every time he tried to angle right, the same sounds redirected him. They were taking him somewhere specific. Thomas stumbled into another clearing. Not the one with the cairn, but similar. Another circle of trees with symbols carved into the bark. This clearing was smaller, and it held no cairn, but the ground was disturbed, freshly turned earth despite the frozen soil, and protruding from the earth were bones. Human bones, old bones mostly, weathered and gray, but some newer, with scraps of frozen flesh still attached. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in patterns around the clearing's perimeter. And standing in the center, waiting for him, was the largest of the things he'd seen at Madison's clearing. It stood perfectly still, head tilted, watching him with eyes that held something Thomas recognized as intelligence. Not human intelligence, something older, colder, more patient. It held what remained of Madison Garcia in its two long arms, cradling her remains the way a child might hold a doll. And when it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was not a growl or roar, but words, syllables in a language Thomas had never heard, but somehow understood. Witiko, it said, and the word resonated in Thomas's chest like a physical blow. Witiko. Atim Witiko. Thomas had heard that word before, 18 years ago during his training. A visiting Native American liaison officer had given a presentation on local legends, cultural context for park rangers working in areas with significant indigenous history. The officer had mentioned the Ojibwe legends of Isle Royale, the stories the Anishinaabe told about the island before European contact. He'd mentioned a word, Witiko, Wendigo, the spirit of hunger, the creature that embodied famine, greed, excess consumption. The thing that had once been human but had crossed a fundamental line, had eaten human flesh, had transformed into something else, something that could never be satisfied, that would consume forever, that grew larger and more skeletal with every meal because its hunger outpaced its feeding. The thing spoke again, and this time its voice layered, multiplied as if 7 or 12 or infinite versions of it spoke simultaneously from the same mouth. He who hunts in our forest, he who walks where the hungry ones dwell, he who will feed us through the long winter. Thomas wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He wanted to scream, but his throat had closed. He stood frozen, paradoxical stillness, his body's response to terror so complete that even flight became impossible. The Wendigo took a step forward, then another. It moved with the patient, unhurried pace of something that had existed for centuries, that had time, that knew its prey would not escape. It still held Madison Garcia's remains, and as it approached, Thomas saw that her face was intact, her eyes open, her expression not fear, but hunger, as if something in her had changed before the end, as if she had begun to transform into what they were. She came to us, the Wendigo said, its voice like ice cracking. She heard our call. She walked into the forest and offered herself to the hunger. You will do the same. You will feed us, and then you will join us, and you will be hungry forever. Thomas's hand found the bear spray on his belt. Stupid, useless, but his training reasserted itself in that moment of absolute terror, and he pulled the canister free, aimed, and fired. The spray hit the Wendigo's face and had no effect. The creature didn't even blink. It took another step forward, close enough now that Thomas could smell it. That sharp, chemical, burnt copper smell he'd noticed at Madison's tent, but concentrated, overwhelming, a stench that made his eyes water and his stomach heave. The Wendigo reached for him with its too long arm, its fingers extending, and Thomas did the only thing his training allowed. He pulled his knife, a 4-inch folding blade completely inadequate, and he slashed at the reaching hand. The blade connected with something that felt like frozen leather. It didn't cut so much as chip, like striking wood. But the Wendigo pulled back, and for the first time, Thomas saw something in its eyes that might have been surprise. Iron, it said, the word a hiss. He carries iron. The knife was carbon steel, not iron, but apparently the distinction didn't matter to something that predated metallurgy. The Wendigo circled right, and Thomas turned with it, keeping the knife between them, his hand shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip. Iron, the Wendigo said again, and the other shapes, the 6 or 11 or infinite others, materialized from the tree line surrounding the clearing. He carries iron, he resists, He will be difficult to take. But we are hungry, another voice said, coming from one of the shapes or all of them. We are always hungry, and he is alone, and the winter is long, and we have time. They began to close in, moving with coordinated precision, cutting off his escape routes. Thomas backed toward the edge of the clearing, his knife extended, knowing it was hopeless, but unable to stop fighting. 18 years in the backcountry had taught him that you fought until you couldn't fight, and even then you kept fighting because surrender was death and fighting was at least defiance. His back hit a tree trunk. The Wendigos stopped advancing, holding position 10 feet away, a circle of skeletal, antlered shapes in the darkness. They were waiting for something, Thomas realized. They were patient. They had time. They would wait for him to exhaust himself, to freeze, to collapse from fear and exposure, and then they would feed, unless he broke the circle. Thomas's headlamp was dying, the beam fading to orange. In the dimming light, he could barely see the Wendigos, but he could feel them. Their attention focused on him with the intensity of absolute hunger. His core temperature was dropping. His hands were numb, his legs shaking. He had minutes, maybe, before hypothermia began affecting his judgment. He had to move now. Thomas chose a gap in the circle, the smallest Wendigo, if size meant anything, and he charged, not away from it. Not trying to slip past, but directly at it, his knife leading, his voice rising in a shout that was half rage and half terror. The Wendigo didn't expect the attack. Thomas's blade caught it in the chest, sinking 2 inches into something that felt like frozen meat. The creature screamed, a sound that shattered the silence, a howl that had no place coming from a throat, and staggered backward. Thomas pulled his knife free and ran. He crashed through the forest downslope, his dying headlamp providing just enough light to avoid the largest trees. Behind him, the Wendigos pursued, but their coordination had broken. They howled and screamed, and the sound chased him through the darkness, but he had gained distance, precious seconds, enough that he might. His foot hit ice, the creek he'd crossed earlier, except now he was hitting it from a different angle, and the ice was thin, and his momentum carried him forward. The ice broke. Thomas plunged into water so cold it stopped his heart. Not metaphorically, not as hyperbole, but literally stopped the rhythmic beating for 3 seconds before shock restarted it. He thrashed to the surface, his lungs pulling air that burned like fire. The current was pulling him, carrying him downstream away from the Wendigos, but also away from Madison's tent, away from any shelter. The water was shallow, only 3 feet, but in November in the Upper Peninsula, 3 feet of water was a death sentence. He had minutes before hypothermia incapacitated him. Thomas grabbed for the bank, his fingers closing on frozen grass, and he hauled himself out of the creek with strength he didn't know he possessed. His headlamp was gone, lost in the water. His knife was gone. He was soaked, freezing in complete darkness, and the Wendigo's howls echoed through the forest, closer now, converging on his position. He stumbled forward, hands extended, feeling his way between trees. His feet were numb, his hands were numb, his core temperature was dropping fast. He could feel the confusion starting, the cognitive impairment that preceded the final stages of hypothermia. He needed fire, needed shelter, needed dry clothes. He needed Madison Garcia's tent, which was somewhere in this darkness, somewhere downstream. If he could just orient himself. If he could remember his training. If he could think through the cold that was turning his brain to ice. A light appeared ahead. Orange, flickering. Firelight. Thomas stumbled toward it, his coordination failing, his vision narrowing. The light grew brighter, resolving into a campfire, and beside the fire sat a figure in a ranger uniform, and Thomas's hypothermia-addled brain registered it as rescue, as safety, as salvation. He collapsed beside the fire, his body shaking violently, and the figure turned to look at him. It was Thomas O'Brien. His own face, his own uniform, sitting calmly beside a campfire that burned without wood, that produced heat he couldn't feel. The doppelganger smiled, and its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "You cannot escape the hunger," it said in Thomas's voice. "The forest has claimed you. In 3 days, when the team arrives, they will find your camp, your equipment, your clothes arranged in a trail leading into the forest. They will search for 7 days and find nothing. In 3 months, hikers will find pieces of you arranged around a cairn. In 3 years, you will be one of us hunting in the darkness, forever hungry, forever feeding, forever alone. Thomas tried to speak, but his jaw wouldn't work. His body was shutting down, core temperature dropping below sustainability. The fake Thomas stood, and as it rose, it stretched, elongated, bones cracking, skin splitting, antlers erupting from its skull. The Wendigo, wearing his face, leaned close, its breath smelling like the grave. "Or," it whispered, "you can feed now. You can give yourself to the hunger willingly as Madison did. You can become like us, and the transformation will be easier, faster, less painful. All you have to do is eat." It held out something that might have been meat, frozen and raw, and Thomas's starving, hypothermic body responded with hunger so intense it obliterated thought. He reached for the offering and remembered the training officer, 18 years ago, explaining the Wendigo legend. Explaining that the curse began with a single bite of human flesh, that once someone crossed that line, the transformation was inevitable. Explaining that the Anishinaabe had specific protocols for dealing with Wendigo cases: isolation, ritual cleansing, and in extreme cases, execution by fire, the only thing that could permanently destroy a Wendigo. Fire. Thomas's numb hand found his pocket, found the waterproof match case he always carried, the backup to his backup, the thing he'd carried for 18 years and never needed. His fingers wouldn't work properly. It took him 3 tries to open the case, 4 tries to extract a match. The Wendigo watched with patient hunger, not interfering, confident that Thomas's hypothermia had progressed too far for resistance. Thomas struck the match against the case. It flared orange, and he touched it to his soaked jacket. The fabric shouldn't have burned. It was synthetic, wet, frozen. But the match touched it, and fire exploded across Thomas's chest. Not painful, not hot, but bright, blazing white-blue, spreading faster than physics allowed. The Wendigo screamed and staggered backward, and Thomas understood in that moment of perfect clarity that he hadn't lit himself on fire. He'd lit the hunger on fire, the corruption that had begun spreading through his body the moment he'd entered the Wendigo's territory. The transformation that would have claimed him within hours. The fire burned cold. It spread across his body, consuming something he couldn't see but could feel. A weight, a presence, a whisper that had been growing in the back of his mind since he'd found Madison's tent. The fire burned it away, and the Wendigos howled and fled, their forms dissolving into shadows, into memory, into the darkness that existed before and beyond human understanding. Thomas O'Brien collapsed beside the fire that burned without fuel, and the last thing he saw before consciousness left was the first gray light of dawn breaking over Lake Superior, and in that light, the silhouette of a float plane descending toward Rock Harbor, 3 days early, arriving impossibly soon, as if time had fractured and reformed around him. He woke in a hospital in Houghton 3 days later, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite that cost him 2 toes and 3 fingers. His memories of the final night were fractured, confused, cataloged by the doctors as hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The SAR team had found him beside Madison Garcia's tent, unconscious, his clothes arranged around him in a spiral pattern he claimed not to remember creating. His radio and GPS were never recovered. His knife was never recovered. Madison Garcia's remains were found by the recovery team at the coordinates Thomas provided, before the hypothermia claimed his coherent memory. The official report listed the cause of death as animal predation, species unknown, despite the fact that Isle Royale's wolf population had never attacked humans, and the pattern of her injuries matched no known predator. Her research was inconclusive. Her tent was removed. Her site was flagged for hazard assessment. Thomas O'Brien retired from the National Park Service in 2009, 6 months after his rescue. He moved to Detroit as far from wilderness as possible and took a job teaching outdoor safety at a community college. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen on Isle Royale, but his students noticed that he refused to discuss Isle Royale specifically, that he steered conversations away from Superior's North Shore. that he kept his classroom at 75 degrees year-round and wore long sleeves even in summer. And on November 18th every year, the anniversary of his search for Madison Garcia, Thomas O'Brien fasted completely, ate nothing, drank only water, because some part of him remembered the offering the Wendigo had made, remembered how close he'd come to accepting, remembered that the hunger lived in everyone, waiting for the moment when survival instinct overcame human prohibition. He never returned to Isle Royale, but sometimes on winter nights when the temperature dropped below freezing, Thomas woke from dreams of gray-white figures with antlers and too many teeth, and he checked his fingers and toes obsessively, counting them, making sure he still had the ones the frostbite hadn't taken, making sure he hadn't lost more in the night, making sure he was still human, making sure the hunger hadn't returned, making sure that the thing he'd seen wearing his face in the forest had been a hallucination, just a trick of hypothermia and fear, and not a prophecy of what he would eventually become. But deep in the forests of Isle Royale, in the clearings where the symbols are carved and the cairns stand ancient, the Wendigos wait. They are patient. They are hungry. They have time. And every November when the island closes for winter and the last float planes depart, they walk the Greenstone Ridge Trail, searching for researchers who camp alone, for rangers who investigate missing persons, for anyone foolish enough to enter their territory, searching for the next person who will hear their call, who will walk into the forest and offer themselves to the hunger, who will become like them, forever feeding, forever starving, forever part of the long winter that has no end. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The photographs were arranged in a perfect circle, faces turned inward, and every single one showed Jordan Hayes smiling at something outside the frame. William Archer crouched beside the arrangement, his knees protesting the October cold that had settled into the Boundary Waters wilderness like something living. 23 photographs, he counted. Polaroids, which struck him as odd. Who used Polaroids anymore in 2014? But there they were, perfectly spaced on the frost-hardened ground of Jordan Hayes' abandoned campsite, each image capturing the missing botany student from a slightly different angle. The same genuine smile, the same relaxed posture, the same unfocused gaze directed at something just beyond the camera's reach. William's breath formed clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunrise, and it was barely noon. His Garmin GPS flickered in his hand, the coordinates jumping erratically between readings that placed him everywhere from his current position at the Curtain Falls Portage to locations 5 miles in opposite directions. He'd stopped trusting it an hour ago, relying instead on the paper map folded in his chest pocket and the landmarks he'd memorized over 16 years of working Superior National Forest. The tent stood undisturbed, its rain fly perfectly taut, stakes driven deep with the precision of someone who knew wilderness camping. William had already looked inside, sleeping bag laid out flat, camp stove assembled but unused, research journal open to a page of detailed sketches depicting indigenous plant species. Jordan's backpack leaned against the interior tent wall, and when he'd checked it, everything had been there. Water filtration system, first aid kit, emergency beacon still in its waterproof case with a full battery, 5 days of freeze-dried meals, bare canister unopened. People didn't vanish from their campsites leaving everything behind. Not in his experience. Not unless something had happened very quickly. Something that made them run without thinking. But Jordan Hayes hadn't run. The photograph circle suggested otherwise. It suggested she'd sat here, methodically placing each image, taking her time with the arrangement while something watched from beyond the frame. William stood, joints cracking, and surveyed the campsite again. The fire ring held charcoal from a single burn, maybe 2 days old based on the ash consistency. A line of stones led from the tent to the tree line, 20 yards of carefully placed markers that served no practical purpose he could identify. Each stone was roughly the same size, each positioned with obvious care. The line ended at a birch tree whose bark had been stripped in a vertical pattern, exposing the pale wood beneath. Someone had carved symbols into the exposed wood, angular shapes that reminded William of the Ojibwe pictographs he'd seen on rock faces deeper in the wilderness, but not quite right. The angles were too sharp, the proportions wrong, as though someone had tried to remember the patterns from a half-forgotten dream. His radio crackled, and dispatch reported the search dogs had lost Jordan's scent at the southern shore of Little Trout Lake. "Just lost it," the handler had said, confusion evident in her voice. One moment the dogs were tracking, the next they'd sat down simultaneously and refused to move forward. They'd whined and pulled backward on their leads, desperate to return to the vehicles. William had seen that behavior once before, 5 years ago. Different lake, different season, but the same desperate animal fear. He pushed the memory down and focused on documenting the scene. The digital camera felt heavy in his cold-numbed fingers as he photographed the circle, the tent, the stone line, the carved tree. Through the viewfinder, he noticed something he'd missed with his naked eye. A thin layer of frost covered everything except the photographs. The Polaroids were completely dry, as though they'd been placed after the frost had formed. But the frost on the surrounding ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no marks at all. The wind died completely. In the boundary waters, the wind never stopped entirely. Not in October, when the temperature differentials between the lakes and the forest created constant air movement. But now the aspens stood motionless, their remaining leaves frozen in place. The usual sounds of the wilderness, bird calls, small animals moving through underbrush, the subtle creak of trees adjusting to temperature changes, had ceased. The silence pressed against William's eardrums like physical weight. Something moved in his peripheral vision. When he turned, there was nothing but forest, the same dense mix of birch, aspen, and pine that covered this entire region. But the sensation of being watched intensified, a crawling awareness along his spine that he'd learned over years in the wilderness to trust absolutely. William's phone buzzed in his pocket. No signal this deep in the boundary waters. Cell towers didn't reach here, which was the entire point of the wilderness area. But the phone was vibrating, insistent. He pulled it out and stared at the screen. No bars, no network connection, but a text message displayed anyway. She smiled for me too. The message had no sender, no number, no timestamp. Just those 5 words. His hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. William deleted the message and powered off the phone completely, which was protocol anyway in a wilderness emergency. Save battery, rely on radio, but when he shoved the device back into his pocket, it buzzed again. Impossible. He'd watched the screen go black. He'd held the power button until the shutdown completed. But there it was, vibrating against his thigh in a pattern that felt almost like Morse code. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The dispatcher's voice came through the radio again, this time with an edge of concern he'd rarely heard from Martha, who'd worked fire and rescue for 27 years. "William, we've got a situation with the records. You need to hear this." He keyed the transmit button. "Go ahead." Jordan Hayes reported missing on October 15, 2014. That's today. But I've got 4 other missing persons reports from this same region. Sarah Mitchell, October 2011. Kevin Tran, October 2008. Maria Delgado, October 2005, and Martha's voice faltered. And Thomas Riley, October 2002. William knew that last name. Thomas Riley had been his partner, his friend, the ranger who'd taught him which trails flooded in spring and where the wolves denned in winter. Thomas had vanished during a solo patrol, and they'd never found a trace. William had been the one to discover his empty campsite, had been the one to call it in, had been the one to spend 3 weeks searching until the first snow forced them to suspend operations. "Martha," William said carefully, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his stomach. "What are the exact dates?" October 15th. All of them, 12 years going back to 2002. All 5 people vanished on October 15th from locations within a 3-mile radius of your current position. He looked at the photograph circle again. 23 images. If the pattern held, there would eventually be more photographs, more victims. But why 23? What did that number signify? The birch tree with the carved symbols caught his attention again. William approached it slowly, pulling his flashlight from his belt despite the daylight. The symbols seemed to shift when he looked directly at them, his eyes refusing to hold them in focus. But at an angle, with the flashlight beam illuminating the carved wood, he could make out a pattern. 23 distinct symbols arranged in a spiral that wound from the base of the tree upward to where the bark stripping stopped. His radio hissed with static, then Martha's voice came through broken and distorted. "William, old records, Ojibwe elder, warning, never entered. Official report. Martha, you're breaking up. Repeat." More static, then fragments. 1987. Elder warned against area, hunting ground, something that feeds 3 moons, harvest moon. The transmission cut off entirely. William tried to respond, but the radio was dead. The LED display dark despite fresh batteries installed that morning. He slapped it against his palm, the old mechanic's fix, but nothing. The device was completely inert. His watch had stopped. The hands frozen at 11:47, which was impossible because he'd checked it when he'd first reached the campsite, and it had been working fine. Automatic watch, no battery, wound by motion. It shouldn't have stopped unless he'd been standing perfectly still for hours. How long had he been here? It had felt like 20 minutes since arriving at Jordan's camp, but the light was wrong now. The sun had moved from its midday position to late afternoon, the shadows long and angular through the birch trees. But that would mean hours had passed, and he had no memory of the time between examining the photographs and noticing the light change. A sound reached him from deeper in the forest north toward the Canadian border. Not quite a voice, but not quite wind either. A low vibration that he felt in his chest before his ears registered it. The sound held a rhythm, almost like words, but in no language he recognized. The Ojibwe communities near the boundary waters sometimes conducted traditional ceremonies in the forest, and William had learned to recognize the cadence of their songs. This was similar but fundamentally wrong, as though someone had taken the structure of those sacred songs and inverted them, reversed every syllable. The photographs rustled, not from wind. The air remained perfectly still, but as though someone was lifting each image slightly and letting it fall. William spun around. The circle was empty. No one there, but the photographs continued their subtle movement, faces turning, the paper catching light at angles that shouldn't be possible with flat surfaces. In each photograph now, Jordan Hayes was no longer smiling. Her expression had changed to fear, mouth open mid-scream, eyes wide with terror, but not looking at the camera anymore, looking past it, behind whoever had taken the shot, at something approaching. William's training kicked in. Document, preserve evidence, call for backup. But his radio was dead, his phone impossible to trust, and the GPS coordinates were meaningless. He was alone in the boundary waters with 5 missing persons, a pattern spanning 12 years, and photographs that moved when they shouldn't. He needed to move. Standing here was a mistake. Some instinct older than his ranger training insisted, but move where? Back to his vehicle was 15 miles through increasingly difficult terrain, and the sun was dropping fast. In October, darkness came early to the northern forests, and navigating the portages by flashlight was dangerous even under normal circumstances. A branch snapped to his left, close, maybe 20 feet. William's hand went to the canister of bear spray on his belt, though he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had made that sound was not a bear. Bears hibernated by mid-October in this region. And besides, the sound had been wrong, too deliberate, too precisely placed to be an animal moving naturally through the forest. "Jordan," he called out, knowing it was foolish but unable to stop himself. "Jordan Hayes, if you can hear me, I'm Ranger Archer. I'm here to help." The silence that followed his shout was complete and suffocating. Even his voice seemed to die mere feet from his mouth, absorbed by the forest rather than echoing naturally through the trees. Then, from the same direction as the branch snap, a voice. Female, young, frightened. "Help me. Please. I'm hurt. I can't move." Every instinct William had developed over 16 years in wilderness search and rescue screamed at him not to respond. The voice was too perfect, too exactly what he wanted to hear. And there was something underneath it, A second sound layered beneath the words like a recording played backward. "Jordan, I need you to keep talking. Help me find you. I'm here. Right here. Please hurry. It's so cold." The voice came from a different direction now, northeast instead of west. Impossible unless Jordan was moving quickly through the forest, but the voice held the same breathless quality of someone injured and stationary. William pulled his compass from his pocket. The needle spun lazily, making full rotations without ever settling on magnetic north. Another piece of equipment failing. He thought of Thomas 5 years ago, and the strange reports that had come in during the search. Compasses malfunctioning. GPS units showing impossible coordinates. Search dogs refusing to track. And the cold. William remembered the cold during Thomas's search. Unseasonable temperatures that dropped below zero despite it being early October. Frozen lakes when they should have been liquid. Frost patterns on trees that looked almost like writing. "William," the voice called again. And this time it was Thomas's voice. His partner's voice unchanged by 5 years in whatever place claimed him. "William, I've been waiting. You need to see. You need to understand." He ran. The training that said never run in the wilderness, never leave a known position, never act on panic, all of it dissolved in the face of hearing Thomas speak. William crashed through undergrowth, vaulted over a deadfall, his breath coming in ragged gasps that crystallized immediately in the frigid air. The forest had changed. He registered it even through his panic. The birch trees were different, their bark hanging in long strips like flesh peeled from bone. The aspens had lost all their leaves suddenly, standing skeletal against the darkening sky, and the ground was covered in frost so thick it looked like snow, crunching under his boots with each step. He broke through into a clearing he'd never seen before, though he'd patrolled this area dozens of times. A perfect circle of bare earth, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by trees that had been stripped of bark. In the center of the clearing stood a structure built from branches and stones, roughly 7 feet tall, vaguely humanoid in shape. Animal bones hung from the branches, deer skulls, wolf jaws, the distinctive beak of a raven. The bones clacked together in a wind that William still couldn't feel. At the base of the structure, arranged in the same circular pattern as the photographs, were personal items. A watch that William recognized instantly as Thomas's, the leather band cracked but still intact. A driver's license with Sarah Mitchell's face smiling from the laminated surface. A university ID for Kevin Tran. A phone case decorated with Maria Delgado's distinctive floral stickers. And a field guide to indigenous plants, its pages open to a detailed illustration of wild ginger, with Jordan Hayes's neat handwriting filling the margins. 5 people, 5 October 15ths, all leading to this clearing, this structure, this place that felt wrong in ways William's mind struggled to process. The temperature dropped again, and this time William could see his breath forming not clouds but crystalline shapes that fell to the ground like snow. Each exhale created intricate ice patterns that shattered when they hit the frost-covered earth. Movement at the tree line. Multiple figures all standing perfectly still, all watching. William spun, counting. 23 figures, exactly matching the number of photographs. They stood at precise intervals around the clearing's perimeter, and as his eyes adjusted to the growing darkness, he realized they were wrong. Too tall, proportions stretched, limbs too thin and jointed in too many places. Their heads tilted at angles that would have broken human necks. One of them stepped forward. In the dying light, William saw Jordan Hayes, or something wearing her shape. The resemblance was perfect from a distance, but the closer it came, the more the image fractured. The smile was too wide, the eyes too dark, the skin too pale and waxy. It moved with a jerking motion, as though learning to operate the form it inhabited. "She smiled for me," it said, and the voice was the one from his phone, from the texts, layered and wrong. They all smile eventually, when they understand, when they see what I am. William backed toward the structure, knowing it was the wrong move but unable to force himself closer to the thing wearing Jordan's face. His hand found a fallen branch, solid and heavy, though he knew with terrible certainty that a piece of wood would be useless against whatever he faced. "You were here before," the Jordan thing said. "5 harvests ago. You brought him to me, Thomas. He resisted longer than most. Strong will, strong spirit. He fed me through an entire winter." "What are you?" William's voice cracked, the words barely above a whisper. "Wendigo," it answered, and the forest responded with a sound like breaking bones. "The first people knew me, respected me. They made offerings, kept their distance, honored the boundaries. But you and your kind, you pushed into every corner, every sacred place, every hunting ground. You forgot the old agreements." More figures stepped from the trees. Some wore faces William recognized from missing persons bulletins spanning decades. Others were older, their forms more decayed, bones visible through translucent skin that looked like ice. All of them moved with that same jerking, learning motion. "Every 3 years," the Wendigo continued, speaking through Jordan's stolen mouth. "One harvest every 3 turns of the seasons, enough to sustain me, enough to honor the old ways, and they come willingly, always. I show them wonders, visions of everything they desire. They smile for me. They walk to me. They offer themselves, thinking they move toward paradise." "Jordan didn't offer herself," William said, surprising himself with his steadiness. "She's a student. She came here to study plants. She didn't know. She knew the moment she crossed the boundary line I've marked for centuries. The stones, Ranger, did you not see the stones? She moved them, rearranged them, broke the pattern. And breaking the pattern means joining it." The thing tilted its head, Jordan's features distorting. "Just as Thomas broke the pattern when he tried to map this region. Just as you break it now by being here, by seeing what should remain hidden." The other figures were closing in, a tightening circle of victims turned predators. William could smell them now, the scent of deep winter and older things, of meat left too long in the cold and something chemical that burned his sinuses. "I can offer you the same vision," the Wendigo said. "The same peace they all found. Or you can run and I will chase, and the ending will be the same but so much more painful. Choose quickly, Ranger. The moon rises, and I grow hungry." William looked at the structure in the clearing's center, at the personal items arranged with such care. Thomas's watch still kept time, he noticed. The hands moved steadily, impossibly, around the face. 5 years of ticking without winding, without stopping. An idea formed, desperate and probably futile. The Ojibwe elder's warning that Martha had tried to relay. Something about 3 moons and harvest moon. October's full moon was called the hunter's moon in some traditions, but the harvest moon had been last month. 3 moons, past, present, future, 3 cycles, 3 offerings. The structure was built from 3 types of wood, William realized. Birch, cedar, pine, the sacred woods of the northern tribes, and the arrangement of bones followed a pattern, not random, but deliberate. A perversion of something, but based on real traditions, real knowledge. "You wear their faces," William said slowly, mind racing. "You take their forms, but you're not them. You're not Jordan or Thomas or any of the others. You're something older, something that needs permission. The old ways required offerings, but they also required consent. True consent, and none of them gave it. They were tricked, deceived." The Wendigo's expression shifted, Jordan's face rippling like water. "Clever," it hissed. "But cleverness won't save you. The boundary is broken, the pattern is disrupted, new terms apply. Then I'll restore it." William moved quickly, grabbing Thomas's watch from the ground. The metal was searingly cold, burning his palm, but he held on. "I'm a ranger, I maintain these lands, and that means maintaining the boundaries, the old agreements. No more harvests, no more victims. I'm ending the pattern." He smashed the watch against a stone, the glass face shattering, the mechanism scattering across the frost. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound that was part human scream and part animal howl. The other figures stumbled, their forms flickering like poor television reception. William grabbed the next item, Sarah Mitchell's license, and tore it in half. The plastic resisted, but adrenaline gave him strength. Another shriek, louder. The clearing grew darker impossibly fast, the last sunlight disappearing as though swallowed. He destroyed Kevin's ID, Maria's phone case, Jordan's field guide, ripping pages and snapping plastic and breaking everything he could reach. Each destruction brought another scream from the Wendigo, and the figures around the clearing collapsed one by one, their stolen forms evaporating into mist that smelled of pine and rot. But Jordan's form remained standing. The thing inside her smiled wider, and William saw that the mouth kept opening, the jaw dislocating entirely, revealing rows of teeth that belonged to no human being. "You understand nothing," it said, voice now stripped of any human quality. "The items are anchors, yes, but she is here, her body, her living warmth. As long as I hold her, the pattern continues." "Where?" William demanded. "Where is she?" The Wendigo gestured toward the structure. "Inside, always inside. The frame is a door, Ranger, one that opens both ways. I step out wearing their shapes. They step in joining the others. An exchange, a balance." William approached the structure, seeing it now as more than just branches and stones. The bones formed patterns around what might have been openings, and the frost on the branches created symbols identical to those carved into the birch tree at Jordan's campsite. "If I go in," he said, "if I make the exchange—" "No bargains," the Wendigo interrupted. "You destroyed the anchors. You broke the established pattern. Now only one ending remains. You enter, and I take your form, and walk among your kind for 3 years until the next harvest. Or you run, and I chase and consume you and walk among your kind anyway." Not those options. William pulled the emergency flare from his belt, the last resort item that every wilderness ranger carried. "Third option, I burn it all down." He struck the flare against its cap and red light exploded across the clearing. The Wendigo recoiled, Jordan's stolen face blistering in the chemical glow. William touched the flare to the structure, and despite the frost, despite the cold, despite everything that suggested fire was impossible here, the branches caught immediately. The flames burned wrong, too bright and too blue, but they burned. The structure collapsed inward, and William heard screams from within it, dozens of voices crying out in surprise and relief and terror. The frost on the ground melted in seconds, the temperature surging upward. The Wendigo lunged at him, no longer bothering with Jordan's form. What William saw in that moment would resist description for the rest of his life. Something massive and skeletal and impossibly thin, with too many limbs and a head like a deer skull stretched to accommodate human eyes. It moved fast, covering the distance between them in a single bound. William swung the flare like a weapon. The flames caught the Wendigo's arm, and the creature's shriek could have shattered glass. It reeled backward, colliding with the burning structure. For a moment it seemed like the thing would simply step through the fire unharmed. But then the flames changed, shifting from blue to white, and the Wendigo began to burn. It burned like old paper, like dried leaves, like everything desiccated and ancient. The stolen faces it had worn rippled across its form as it thrashed. Jordan, Thomas, Sarah, Kevin, Maria, and dozens of others, centuries of victims, all surfacing briefly before the fire consumed them. The creature fell into the collapsing structure, and the ground beneath it opened. Not a physical hole, but something else. A darkness that was more absence than void. The Wendigo fell into that darkness, still burning, still screaming, and then the opening sealed, and the forest was suddenly, shockingly silent. William stood in the clearing, the dying flare still clutched in his hand. The other figures, the victims who had stood at the tree line, were gone. The frost had melted entirely, and the temperature was merely cold, October-appropriate cold, rather than the bone-deep freeze that had gripped the area. Something moved in the ruins of the structure. William approached carefully, and found Jordan Hayes lying unconscious among the ashes, her skin dangerously cold but alive, breathing, real. Her field guide lay beside her, unburned despite the flames that had consumed everything else. He radioed for emergency evac, and to his surprise, the radio worked. Martha's voice came through clear and concerned, and she promised a helicopter within the hour. The GPS coordinates locked instantly, showing his exact position. William wrapped Jordan in his jacket and waited. She didn't wake, but her breathing steadied and her skin gradually warmed. He didn't look at the place where the structure had been, at the scorch marks that would fade within days, leaving no evidence of what had happened. When the helicopter arrived, the paramedics found Jordan dehydrated and hypothermic but otherwise unharmed. She had no memory of the past 3 days, no explanation for how she'd ended up miles from her campsite. The official report would list her as found suffering from exposure and disorientation, a cautionary tale about solo camping in the Boundary Waters. William didn't mention the Wendigo, the structure, the victims' faces, or Thomas's watch. He filed a standard report noting difficult search conditions and eventual successful recovery. Martha looked at him with concern when he came back to the station, noting the hollowness around his eyes, but she didn't ask questions. 3 weeks later, William stood at Jordan's campsite again. The photographs were gone, collected as evidence and then mysteriously lost in processing. The tent had been removed, the fire ring scattered, but the line of stones remained, and William spent an hour carefully restoring them to their original pattern. A boundary marker that had stood for longer than Superior National Forest had existed. The birch tree with the carved symbols was healing, bark growing back over the exposed wood. Within a year, there would be no sign of the carvings. But William photographed them anyway, documenting the patterns, comparing them to the pictographs he found in old ethnographic texts at the regional library. He found references to the Wendigo in journals from French trappers and missionaries, descriptions that matched what he'd seen with disturbing accuracy. He found Ojibwe oral histories that spoke of boundaries that must be maintained, of hunting grounds that belonged to spirits, of the terrible price for violating ancient agreements. Jordan Hayes returned to university and never came back to the Boundary Waters. She changed her major from botany to art history, as far from wilderness studies as possible. William saw her once, 2 years later, at a symposium in Duluth. She looked healthy, happy, with no visible signs of her ordeal. When their eyes met across the conference hall, she gave him a small nod of recognition but didn't approach. He understood. Some things were better left unspoken. The pattern of disappearances stopped. October 15th came and went in 2017, 2020, and 2023 without incident. No missing hikers, no abandoned campsites, no mysterious circumstances. The Wendigo was gone, destroyed or banished or simply dormant. William didn't know which, and he tried not to wonder. But on October nights when the temperature dropped unseasonably low, when the wind died and the forest fell silent, William would stand on his porch and look north toward the Boundary Waters. Sometimes he thought he heard Thomas's voice on those nights, calling from the darkness. Sometimes he saw movement at the tree line, figures standing just beyond the reach of his porch light. He never investigated. Some boundaries, once restored, should not be tested. The old agreements held, and William had no intention of disrupting them again. The wilderness kept its secrets, and he kept his distance, and that was how it would remain. In the ranger station, locked in a drawer that only William could access, Thomas's shattered watch lay among the other evidence he'd never turned in. Once a month he checked on it, just to confirm that the hands remained frozen at the moment of destruction. They always did. The watch never moved, never ticked, never showed any sign of the impossible life it had held when the Wendigo had power over it. Except on October 15th. On those days, William didn't check. On those days, he stayed as far from the evidence drawer as possible, because he knew with absolute certainty that on October 15th the watch would be ticking again, counting down to something, marking time that moved in directions he couldn't comprehend. The Wendigo was gone. He had to believe that. But the forest was older than any human understanding, and the things that lived in its deepest places followed rules that predated civilization. William had ended one pattern, but patterns had a way of recurring, of finding new forms, of adapting to changing circumstances. He kept watching. He kept maintaining the boundaries. And he kept the stories to himself because some truths were too dangerous to share, too heavy for others to carry. The Boundary Waters remained beautiful and wild and treacherous, and visitors continued to marvel at its pristine wilderness, never knowing what truly waited in its shadows. William Archer aged in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of years. His hair went gray too quickly, and his eyes held shadows that no amount of sleep could erase. He trained new rangers, taught them the practical skills they needed, but he also taught them to respect the boundaries, to honor the old ways, to never dismiss the warnings that had been passed down through generations. "The wilderness doesn't belong to us," he told them. "We're just visitors temporarily allowed. And some places aren't for visiting at all. Some places are better left alone." Most of them thought he was being poetic or overly cautious. A few understood. Those few saw the way he marked certain areas as restricted on the patrol maps, saw how he diverted trails away from specific regions, saw how seriously he took the old Ojibwe warnings that had become little more than folklore. Jordan Hayes never spoke about what happened in those missing 3 days, but she painted, obsessively. Abstract works that sold well in Minneapolis galleries, all of them depicting similar themes. White against blue against black, spirals that drew the eye inward, figures at the edge of frames, their faces turned away. 23 of something, always 23, though the subject changed from painting to painting. One art critic wrote that her work evoked the liminal space between civilization and wilderness, the thin border where human understanding fails and older truths emerge. Jordan framed that review and hung it in her studio, and sometimes she would stand before it and wonder if the critic knew how right they were. She never returned to the boundary waters, but in her dreams, she walked through frost-covered forests, following stone markers, approaching a structure built from branches and bones. In those dreams, she remembered everything. The voice that had called her deeper into the wilderness, the visions it had shown her, herself famous, successful, loved, all her ambitions realized. The way she had walked willingly toward the clearing, smiling, certain she was moving toward her destiny, and she remembered the moment the illusion had shattered, when the thing had shed its disguise and shown her what it truly was. She remembered screaming until her voice gave out, remembered the cold that went beyond temperature, remembered joining the others inside the structure, suspended in ice that preserved their bodies while the Wendigo wore their shapes. She remembered William Archer's face when he looked into the flames and saw her there, alive but not alive, present but trapped in the space between. She remembered the moment the fire destroyed the structure, and she fell back into her own body, the transition so sudden and violent that her mind had protected itself by forgetting. But the forgetting never lasted in dreams. In dreams, she was still in that clearing, still suspended in ice, still watching through eyes that weren't quite hers as the Wendigo walked in her skin. And sometimes, on October nights when the temperature dropped and the wind died, she would wake with frost on her breath and know that somewhere in the boundary waters something ancient and hungry was testing the boundaries, searching for weakness, waiting for the pattern to resume. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The smell reached Thomas O'Brien 2 miles before he found the camp. Meat left too long in summer heat. Except it was January in Glacier National Park, and the thermometer clipped to his pack read -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Decay shouldn't smell this strong and cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Decay shouldn't smell at all. O'Brien had spent 8 years with the Park Service explaining away the inexplicable. Hikers swore they'd seen mountain lions the size of bears, perspective and poor lighting. Campers reported hearing voices in empty wilderness, wind through rock formations and overactive imaginations. A family once insisted their tent had been circled by something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human, probably a bear with an injured front paw. O'Brien had rational explanations for everything, and he delivered them with the smug certainty of someone who'd never encountered anything his education couldn't classify. The smell was making him reconsider. Madison Garcia had been missing for 6 days, 29 years old, wildlife biologist with the University of Montana, experienced winter camper. She'd been conducting a solo study on wolverine populations along the Going to the Sun Road corridor. an area that should have been straightforward even in winter conditions. Her last radio check-in had been January 14th at 6:32 p.m., her voice calm and professional as she reported coordinates that put her near the Oberlin Creek drainage. She'd mentioned seeing unusual tracks and said she wanted to document them before losing light. No one had heard from her since. The search had been suspended after 4 days, standard protocol when blizzard conditions made helicopter operations impossible and ground teams risked becoming casualties themselves. But the storm had broken yesterday, leaving behind 3 feet of new snow and temperatures that made O'Brien's teeth ache even through his balaclava. He'd volunteered to do a preliminary sweep before committing full SAR resources, partly because he knew the area, mostly because he wanted to prove Garcia had simply had equipment failure and was hunkered down waiting for extraction like any sensible person would. The smell suggested otherwise. He followed it through snow that came up to his knees, his MSR snowshoes sinking deep despite their surface area. The Garmin GPS on his wrist showed Garcia's last known coordinates were another half-mile ahead, but the smell was getting stronger, thick enough now that he could taste it. Copper and rot and something else. Something his brain kept trying to classify as burned hair. The forest here was different. O'Brien had hiked this drainage a dozen times, knew every landmark, every twist of the creek. But the trees seemed wrong now, their bark stripped in long vertical gashes that exposed pale wood underneath. Not animal damage. The marks were too uniform, too deliberate. And there were symbols carved into some of the trunks, crude pictographs that looked vaguely Native American, stick figures with distended stomachs, mouths open wide, surrounding what might have been a human form. Or might have been prey. O'Brien pulled out his radio. "Base, this is O'Brien. I'm approximately 0.5 miles from Garcia's last known position, seeing some unusual markings on the trees here. Possible historical Native American site. Might want to contact the Blackfeet Tribal Historic Preservation Office before we..." Static burst from the speaker so loud and sudden that O'Brien dropped the radio. It hit the snow, still transmitting that harsh white noise, but underneath it he could hear something else. A voice, high-pitched and desperate, speaking too fast to understand. Then it cut out completely, leaving silence so absolute that O'Brien realized he couldn't hear anything. No wind, no distant bird calls, nothing. He picked up the radio and tried again. Dead. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the device refused to power on. His phone was the same, full bars of signal according to the screen, but when he tried to dial out, nothing happened. The iPhone's touchscreen felt warm despite the cold, and when he looked closer, he saw condensation forming inside the glass, moisture that shouldn't be possible in air this dry. Something was wrong with the temperature. O'Brien's thermometer still read -18, but he was sweating inside his layers. The air around him felt thick, humid, tropical. He pulled off his glove to touch a tree trunk and jerked his hand back. The bark was hot, fever hot, and that smell of decay was coming from inside it, from the wood itself. Madison Garcia's camp was in a clearing another 200 yards ahead. O'Brien approached slowly, every rational instinct screaming that this violated multiple principles of physics and biology, and he should document it carefully, scientifically, while a deeper, older part of his brain whispered that he should run. The tent was shredded, not torn by weather or animals, but shredded, long parallel cuts through the nylon that exposed the interior. Garcia's equipment was scattered, sleeping bag ripped open and spread across the snow, camp stove crushed flat, food supplies torn apart and strewn in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. But no blood, no signs of struggle, no body. O'Brien circled the site, cataloging details. Garcia's journal lay open near the collapsed tent, pages warped from moisture but still legible. The last entry was dated January 14th, the day she'd disappeared. "The tracks I found aren't Wolverine. They're humanoid but wrong, toes elongated, heel barely touching ground, stride length suggesting something 7-8 feet tall. Following them up the drainage. Temperature dropped 30 degrees in 5 minutes. My thermometer must be broken. It's showing -40, but I'm not cold. I'm hungry. So hungry. Haven't eaten since breakfast, but feel like I'm starving. going to follow the tracks until dark. Below that, written in shakier handwriting, "It's watching me write this. It wants me to know. The Algonquian were right. Witakau. The hunger that walks. It's so cold, but I'm so warm and so hungry, and it's showing me things I shouldn't see, shouldn't know. The others are still here. All of them. They never left. They're in the trees." The final line was barely legible, written so hard the pen had torn through the paper. "Don't let it touch you." O'Brien's hands were trembling. Not from cold, he still felt that impossible heat, sweat running down his spine despite the Arctic temperature. He pulled out his camera to photograph the journal, but the lens was fogged, condensation coating every surface. When he tried to wipe it clear, his glove came away wet and red. Blood. Fresh blood. Still liquid despite the cold. He looked up and saw them. Bodies. Dozens of bodies, suspended in the trees around the clearing. Not hanging from ropes, but embedded in the trunks themselves, as if the wood had grown around them and pulled them inside. Arms and legs protruded at angles, faces pressed against bark, mouths open in silent screams. Some were fresh enough that he could see ice crystals on their eyelashes. Others were mummified, preserved by cold and something else, something that had hollowed them out and left only skin stretched over empty rib cages. He recognized Madison Garcia in the closest tree. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, pressed against the trunk 20 feet up. Her eyes were open and they tracked his movement. O'Brien stopped breathing. Garcia's mouth moved, jaw working like she was trying to speak. No sound came out, but her lips formed words. "Run. It's coming." The temperature dropped. Actually dropped this time, plummeting so fast that the sweat on O'Brien's skin turned to ice, burning like acid. His breath crystallized instantly, forming clouds so thick he could barely see. And in that sudden fog, something moved. Tall, impossibly tall. Skeletal thin with skin stretched tight over bones that jutted at wrong angles. Its legs bent backward like a deer's, but the torso was almost human, arms reaching down past where knees should be. The head was the worst, elongated skull with antlers growing from the temples, jaw distended to reveal rows of broken teeth, and eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow phosphorescence. It moved through the trees with fluid grace that made O'Brien's stomach turn, never quite touching the ground, leaving no tracks in the deep snow. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was like wind through a cave. Hollow, endless, hungry. Witakau sees. Witakau knows. Witakau hungers. The voice wasn't speaking English, but O'Brien understood it anyway, the meaning crawling directly into his brain. This was the Wendigo, the winter cannibal spirit of Algonquian legend that he'd always dismissed as myth. Cautionary tales to prevent starvation cannibalism, nothing more. Except it was here, it was real, and it was looking at him with intelligence that was ancient and alien and absolutely horrifyingly aware. O'Brien ran, training and reason abandoned, replaced by pure animal terror. He crashed through the clearing past Garcia's ruined camp, into the forest beyond. Behind him, that hollow wind voice laughed, and the sound multiplied, echoing from every direction at once. The trees were moving, not swaying in wind. There was no wind, but twisting, branches reaching down like hands, roots erupting from snow to snag his snowshoes. O'Brien stumbled, caught himself, kept running. The faces in the trees watched him pass, and some of them were still alive enough to beg. "Help me. Please, it hurts. Make it stop. Kill me. God, please kill me. Join us. It's better. The hunger stops when you stop fighting." O'Brien's lungs burned. The air had gone from tropical to Arctic and back again, temperature fluctuating wildly enough that he couldn't catch his breath. Ice formed on his beard, melted, formed again. His legs were slowing, muscles seizing from cold and exertion and sheer terror. The Wendigo kept pace effortlessly, sometimes visible in his peripheral vision, sometimes just a presence felt in the marrow of his bones. It wasn't chasing him. It was hurting him. He burst into another clearing and stopped, gasping. This space was different. unnatural. The snow had been cleared in a perfect circle 50 feet across, and the ground underneath was covered in bones, human bones, picked clean and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. Skulls formed a spiral leading to the center where a larger skull sat. Not human, not animal. Something in between with antlers still attached and jaw broken into pieces. The Wendigo emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. In the pale January light, O'Brien could see it clearly now. The stretched skin covered in white fur, the distended stomach that should have made movement impossible, but somehow didn't. The hands tipped with claws that were actually broken finger bones elongated and sharpened. And the eyes, those yellow eyes, held the memory of being human, held the moment when hunger became something more than physical need, became identity, became purpose. "You don't believe," the Wendigo said, and this time it spoke English, words formed with effort by a mouth not designed for human speech. Skeptic, rationalist, everything explained, everything understood. O'Brien wanted to respond, wanted to maintain that professional distance that had served him so well, but his voice wouldn't work. The cold had penetrated too deep, freezing thought and reason. "We were like you," the Wendigo continued. "All of us. Before the hunger. Before the change." We explained it away. Hypothermia causes hallucinations. Starvation causes delusions. The mind creates what it needs to survive. It tilted its head, antlers scraping together with a sound like grinding bones. But some hungers cannot be explained. Some thirsts cannot be quenched. Some transformations cannot be reversed. It moved closer, and O'Brien could smell it now. That same decay smell from before, but stronger, overwhelming. The smell of meat left too long, of bodies digesting themselves, of hunger so profound it had become a physical presence. Madison Garcia understood at the end, the Wendigo said. She fought. They all fight. But the cold breaks them. The hunger breaks them, and when they break, we welcome them. The forest welcomes them. The trees remember. The snow remembers. The winter remembers everything. O'Brien's hand found his belt, fingers closing around the bear spray canister he'd never actually had to use. It was a futile gesture. What was bear spray against something that shouldn't exist? But it was all he had. The Wendigo laughed, that hollow wind sound. "Yes, fight. Please fight. The meat tastes better when seasoned with fear." O'Brien sprayed. The capsicum stream hit the Wendigo square in the face, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then it shrieked. A sound so loud and so wrong that O'Brien's ears popped and blood ran hot down his neck. The creature stumbled back, clawing at its eyes, and O'Brien ran again, not questioning the small miracle, just moving. But the forest had other ideas. The ground opened beneath his feet. Not a hole, not a crevasse, just the snow suddenly gone, replaced by darkness that reached up with cold hands. O'Brien fell, sliding down an incline he couldn't see. Snow and ice and darkness tumbling together. He hit bottom hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, lying stunned in blackness so complete he couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. When his vision adjusted, or when the darkness lightened, he couldn't tell which, he realized he was in a cave. Not a natural cave. The walls were lined with more bodies, but these were older, mummified by extreme cold into leather and bone. They sat in alcoves carved into ice, positioned carefully, reverently like a gallery. And they all faced the same direction, toward the center of the chamber, where something massive crouched in shadow. O'Brien's remaining rational mind tried to catalog what he was seeing. Archaeological significance, evidence of historical habitation, possible tribal burial site requiring immediate documentation and protection. But the bodies were moving, slight movements barely perceptible, a finger twitching, a jaw working, eyelids fluttering. And they were all whispering, a chorus of voices so faint he felt them more than heard them. Hungry, so hungry, always hungry, never full, never satisfied, never enough. The shape in the center stirred, larger than the Wendigo above, older, more completely transformed. This was the source, the first, the original hunger that had spawned all the others. Its body was barely recognizable as having once been human, more ice than flesh, more hunger than form, a walking wound in reality. It spoke, and its voice was the sound of glaciers calving, of ice sheets grinding continents to dust. You have seen. You cannot unsee. You know. You cannot unknow. Choose now. Become like us, or feed us. Both are welcome. Both serve the hunger. O'Brien's mind, clinging to reason like a drowning man to driftwood, tried to find an out, a loophole, a rational explanation that would let him wake up from this nightmare. But there was none. This was real. This was happening, and he had to choose. Become a monster, or become food. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Join us. It's better. The pain stops. The cold stops. Only the hunger remains, and the hunger is everything, and everything is simple. O'Brien thought about Madison Garcia, her peaceful face pressed into tree bark, her warning scrawled in a journal. Don't let it touch you. She'd tried to warn him. She'd known what waited in these woods, had documented it with a scientist's precision, even as it consumed her. He thought about all the missing persons cases over the years, the disappearances he'd explained away with rational theories about falls and exposure and animal attacks. How many of them had ended here, in this cave, facing this choice? He thought about going home, about his apartment in Kalispell with its bookshelves full of biology texts and geology surveys, about Sunday morning coffee and NPR, about the comfortable, mundane world where things made sense and monsters were metaphors. That world had never existed. He'd just been fortunate enough never to look closely at the shadows. The thing in the center moved closer, and O'Brien could see its face now, or the memory of a face, features stretched and distorted by centuries of hunger. But the eyes were still human, still aware, still suffering. It had been someone once. It had been a person who made choices and had loved ones and thought they understood the world. Choose, it said again, reaching out with hands that were ice and bone in desperate need. Thomas O'Brien, 8-year veteran of the Park Service, man who'd built his identity on skepticism and rational thought, who'd never met a mystery he couldn't explain, made his choice. He grabbed a shard of ice from the cave floor, sharp, frozen harder than steel, and drove it into his own throat. Better to die human than live as that. The cold was instantaneous and absolute, not the gradual numbness of exposure, but a cold that started from inside and radiated out, freezing blood in his veins before it could pump. His vision darkened at the edges, consciousness fading, but not fast enough. The Wendigo from above was there, moving impossibly fast, catching him before he hit the ground. It pressed a clawed hand over the wound, and O'Brien felt something worse than death flowing into him. Hunger, pure and absolute, the need to consume that transcended all other thought. No escape, it whispered. No easy deaths, no endings, only transformation, only hunger, only winter. O'Brien tried to scream, but his throat wouldn't work, vocal cords frozen. He felt his body changing, cells crystallizing, humanity draining away like water through cupped hands. The hunger grew and grew and grew until it was everything, until he couldn't remember being anything but hungry. The last rational thought Thomas O'Brien had before the hunger consumed even memory was that he'd been wrong about everything. There were no rational explanations. There never had been. They found O'Brien's snowshoes 3 days later, abandoned at the trailhead near Oberlin Creek. His truck sat in the parking lot undisturbed, keys still in his pocket when they searched it with a warrant. His apartment showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. His bank account remained untouched, credit cards unused. Thomas O'Brien had simply vanished, just like Madison Garcia, just like the 17 other people who disappeared in Glacier National Park over the past 30 years. Just like the 43 before them, if you went back far enough. If you checked records that the Park Service kept but didn't publicize because tourism mattered and unsolved mysteries were bad for business. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead from exposure. A memorial service was held. His sister collected his belongings. His position was filled by a bright-eyed recent graduate from Colorado State who arrived with the same confident skepticism, the same rational worldview, the same certainty that nature was knowable and conquerable and safe. She lasted 6 months before the winter took her too. Because some hungers are older than reason, some truths hide in places rational minds refuse to look, and some forests remember what humans have forgotten, that we were prey long before we were predators, that winter is not a season but a test, and that the line between human and monster is thinner than the ice on a frozen lake. In the deep woods of Glacier National Park, where the Going to the Sun Road curves through ancient territory, things move between the trees that park rangers no longer investigate. The bodies in the wood multiply slowly, steadily, fed by tourists and hikers and the occasional professional who thinks they understand wilderness. The Wendigo is patient, winter is eternal, and the hunger never stops. On cold January nights when the temperature drops below -20 and the wind howls through empty valleys, you can hear them if you listen carefully. Voices calling from the forest, desperate and hungry, inviting you to step off the trail, to investigate the unusual tracks, to follow the smell of decay and snow that should preserve everything. Come closer, they whisper. Come see. Come understand. Come feed the hunger that never dies. Thomas O'Brien walks among them now, if walking is the right word for the jerking, graceless movement of something that used to be human. He remembers his name sometimes, in the moments between feedings when the hunger recedes enough to allow thought. He remembers his apartment, his books, his certainty. Mostly he remembers being wrong. And on the very worst nights when tour groups camp too far from established sites and someone inevitably wanders off to investigate strange sounds, Thomas O'Brien remembers enough of who he was to try to warn them. He forms words with a mouth not designed for speech, pushes thoughts through a brain restructured by hunger and cold and transformation. Run, he tries to say. Don't believe what you see. Everything you know is wrong. Run, run, run. But it comes out as wind through trees, as ice creaking, as the hollow call of something that sounds almost human but isn't, hasn't been, will never be again. And the tourists come closer. They always do, because humans are curious creatures, and certainty is a comfortable lie, and the forest always needs more bodies to fill the trees. The Wendigo sees, the Wendigo knows, the Wendigo hungers, and the hunger never stops. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The shadows pointed the wrong direction. Robert Fitzgerald noticed it first at 11:47 a.m., when the sun hung almost directly overhead, and his own shadow should have been a tight circle at his feet, but instead stretched 15 feet to the east, impossibly long, impossibly dark, and moving independent of his body when he shifted his weight. He stood motionless for 30 seconds, watching his shadow sway and ripple like fabric underwater, while he remained perfectly still, and his rational mind, his Berkeley biology degree, his 3 years of empirical fieldwork, his absolute certainty that the universe operated on observable laws, began to fracture at the edges. Big Bend National Park in late June was a furnace. The Chisos Mountains rose from the Chihuahuan Desert like bones breaking through skin, all exposed rock and sparse vegetation, and the South Rim Trail, where Robert conducted his raptor survey, climbed to 7,400 feet through terrain that killed unprepared hikers with methodical efficiency every summer. He'd started at dawn, documenting peregrine falcon nest sites, and the morning had been routine until the shadows stopped obeying physics. Robert pulled out his iPhone, confirmed the GPS coordinates, checked the compass app. All functional. The sun's position matched the expected azimuth for June 24, 2015, at this latitude. His shadow should not be pointing east. His shadow should definitely not be moving when he stood still. He raised his hand. His shadow raised its hand 3 seconds later. The movement delayed, asynchronous. Robert felt his pulse accelerate, felt sweat that had nothing to do with the 100-degree heat prickle across his scalp. He was a scientist. He documented anomalies. He turned on his phone's camera, and recorded video of his shadow moving independent of his body, moving with liquid grace, fingers spreading wider than his own, head tilting at angles his neck couldn't achieve. After 2 minutes of recording, Robert's phone died. Full battery to black screen in an instant, the device hot enough to burn his palm. He dropped it, watched it clatter on the limestone trail, and when he looked back at the ground, his shadow was normal again, a tight oval at his feet, perfectly aligned with the overhead sun. The ranger station had dispatched him that morning to investigate a missing person report. Connor Burke, 19 years old, from Austin, 2 days overdue from a solo backpacking trip on the South Rim. Standard protocol. Robert would hike the route Connor had filed with the park office, check the established campsites, document any signs of the missing hiker. The park saw 3 to 5 missing persons cases every year, usually ending with embarrassed hikers who'd lost track of time or taken wrong turns. Robert had participated in 7 searches during his 3 years at Big Bend. 6 had been false alarms. 1 had been a body, heat stroke, empty water bottles, preventable tragedy. Connor Burke's disappearance had a detail that bothered the chief ranger enough to mention it twice during the briefing. This was the 4th person to go missing on the South Rim Trail in the past 18 months. The other 3 had been found eventually, 1 dead from exposure, 2 alive but suffering from what the incident reports diplomatically termed severe psychological distress and dehydration-induced confusion. Both survivors had been hospitalized in Alpine, and both had been unable or unwilling to provide coherent accounts of their experiences. Robert hadn't thought much about the pattern until his shadow started moving on its own. He retrieved his dead iPhone, slipped it into his pack, and continued up the trail. The rational explanation was heat stroke beginning to affect his perception. The desert played tricks on human neurology. Dehydration, hyperthermia, exhaustion could all produce hallucinations. Except Robert had consumed 3 liters of water since dawn, his core temperature was regulated, and his cognitive function remained sharp. He could recite the periodic table backwards, could calculate the hypotenuse of the triangle formed by his elevation gain and lateral distance traveled. His brain was working fine. And his shadow had moved independent of his body. The South Rim Trail climbed through a landscape that looked like Mars. Red rock, sparse vegetation, sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Robert passed through a section of trail where erosion had exposed a rock face, and he noticed something he'd missed on previous surveys. Symbols carved into the stone. Not petroglyphs. These were fresh, sharp-edged, cut within the past few years. They formed a sequence. Circles with radiating lines, triangles within triangles, glyphs that resembled eyes or stars or both. Robert photographed them with his backup camera, a Nikon DSLR that still functioned. The symbols ran for 30 feet along the rock face, concentrated around a natural alcove where the stone formed a shallow cave. Inside the alcove, Robert found evidence of recent habitation, scorch marks from fires, empty water bottles, a sleeping bag that had been shredded as if by claws or knives. And on the back wall of the alcove, painted in something dark that might have been blood, more symbols, the same repeating patterns but larger, more complex, arranged around a central image that made Robert's stomach tighten. The central image showed a human figure, arms spread, head tilted back. Around the figure were shadow shapes, black silhouettes with no details, no features, just voids in the shape of people. The shadow shapes were reaching toward the human figure, and the painting's perspective suggested they were emerging from the ground, rising like smoke, converging on the person at the center. Robert's DSLR died. The battery indicator had shown 70% charge. Now the screen was black, the device unresponsive. He tried turning it on. Nothing. Both his phone and his camera, professional-grade electronics, had failed within an hour. He backed out of the alcove and nearly stepped on it. A circle of stones, precisely arranged, each stone painted with a symbol. The circle was 6 feet in diameter, and at the cardinal points north, south, east, west were larger stones with more elaborate markings. Inside the circle, the dirt was disturbed, as if something had been buried and recently exhumed. Robert knelt beside the circle, examining the stones without touching them. The symbols matched those on the rock face. and now that he was paying attention, he noticed they were everywhere. Scratched into trees, painted on boulders, carved into the trail itself. Whoever had made them had spent months, maybe years, marking this section of the South Rim with obsessive precision. A sound reached him from upslope. Rhythmic, metallic, like a bell or chime. Robert froze, listening. The sound came again, 3 clear tones echoing off the rock faces. Then silence. Connor Burke? Robert's voice fell flat in the thin air, no echo. "This is Ranger Fitzgerald. If you can hear me, call out." No response. The silence felt wrong. No birds, no insects, no wind. The desert was never completely silent. There was always something, always ambient sound. This was the silence of a recording studio, of artificial absence. Robert continued upslope, his pace quickening. The symbols grew denser, covering every available surface. The trail passed through a narrow defile between rock walls, and someone had painted the walls floor to ceiling with the shadow figures, hundreds of them, overlapping, reaching upward. Walking through the defile felt like being swallowed. Beyond the defile, the trail opened onto the South Rim itself, a dramatic escarpment with views across 100 miles of desert. The camping area here consisted of 3 established sites, stone windbreaks built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. 2 sites were empty. The third held Connor Burke's tent. The tent was set up correctly, guy lines taut, rainfly secure. Connor's backpack leaned against the windbreak, his boots arranged neatly beside the tent entrance. His water bottles were full. His food bag hung properly from the bear pole. Everything suggested he'd set up camp and then simply walked away, leaving all his supplies. Robert approached the tent and noticed the smell, not decay, but something else. Something that reminded him of ozone after lightning strikes, sharp and electrical. The tent's fabric was covered in a thin layer of dust that had settled in patterns, and those patterns formed shapes, silhouettes, shadow figures pressed against the nylon as if they'd stood outside the tent, their forms leaving impressions in the dust. He called out again. "Connor Burke, this is the National Park Service. Your family is concerned. If you're in the area, please respond." Movement at the edge of his vision. Robert turned, saw nothing, but the sensation remained. The feeling of being watched, of presence just beyond perception. His heart rate elevated, his breathing quickened. He was not a superstitious person. He did not believe in ghosts or demons or supernatural phenomena. But something in this place was wrong in ways his rational mind could not categorize. The tent zipper was closed. Robert pulled it open and looked inside. Connor Burke had been an art student, apparently. The tent's interior was covered in drawings, taped to the walls, spread across the floor, layered on top of his sleeping bag. Hundreds of drawings, all done in charcoal or pencil, all showing the same subject, shadow figures. Some were rough sketches, gestural studies of form. Others were detailed, photorealistic renderings of humanoid shapes composed entirely of darkness. The most recent drawings showed the figures in a circle, surrounding a human form, presumably Connor himself. And in these drawings, the shadows were reaching out, touching, pulling. The final drawing, the one lying on top of Connor's sleeping bag, showed a figure walking into a cave mouth surrounded by shadow shapes, and the figure was smiling. Robert backed out of the tent, his professional detachment dissolving completely. This was not heat stroke. This was not confusion. Connor Burke had spent days documenting something he was seeing, something that had ultimately led him away from safety. And whatever he'd been seeing had left physical evidence. The symbols, the paintings, the dust patterns on the tent. A shadow moved across the ground to Robert's left. He turned toward it, saw nothing that could have cast it. The sun was directly overhead. There were no clouds. The shadow slid across the limestone like oil, humanoid in shape, and it moved toward the trail that led north, away from the established route, into the backcountry where hikers were prohibited from camping. Robert should have radioed for backup. Should have documented the scene, returned to the station, filed a report. Instead, he followed the shadow. Not because he wanted to, but because his rational mind demanded explanation, demanded evidence, demanded proof that what he was experiencing had a basis in observable reality. The shadow led him north along a narrow trail that didn't appear on any map. The trail wound between rock formations, descended into a canyon that cut through the mountain's flank. The canyon walls were covered in symbols, thousands of them, layered across decades or centuries. Some were weathered, ancient, others were fresh, painted recently. The canyon floor was stone scoured by flash floods, and along the walls were alcoves, natural shelters worn into the rock. One alcove was larger than the others, deep enough to qualify as a cave. The shadow moved toward it, then disappeared at the threshold. Robert stopped at the cave entrance, his pulse hammering. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to retreat, but the curiosity that had made him a scientist overrode caution. He pulled his flashlight from his pack, clicked it on. The beam illuminated the cave's interior, 20 feet deep, 10 feet wide, ceiling high enough to stand. The walls were covered in paintings, and these were not amateur work. These were sophisticated, executed with skill and precision, depicting scenes that Robert's archaeological training recognized as ritualistic. The paintings showed gatherings, groups of robed figures arranged in circles, arms raised, surrounding central altars. The altars held offerings, animals, objects, and in some images, human forms. The robed figures were painted in red and white, but surrounding them, emerging from the ground and walls, were the shadow figures, rendered in pure black, consuming light. At the back of the cave was an altar, and this one was not painted. It was real. Stone table, 3 feet high, covered in wax from hundreds of burned candles. The altar's surface was stained dark, and arranged on it were objects, bones, animal and human, crystals, coins, photographs. The photographs showed people, and Robert recognized one, Connor Burke, smiling, a selfie taken on a hiking trail. There were other photographs, 12 of them. Robert examined each one, his hands shaking. 3 of the faces he recognized from incident reports, the missing hikers from the past 18 months. The others were strangers, but their photographs had been placed on this altar alongside bones and ritual components, and Robert understood with sickening clarity that this was not a historical site. This was active. Someone was using this cave. Someone was conducting ceremonies, someone was taking hikers. Robert's flashlight flickered, dimmed, died. He shook it, tried replacing the batteries from his pack. The new batteries were dead too, fully charged lithium cells that should have worked for 20 hours. He stood in complete darkness, in a cave decorated with ritual paintings, surrounded by evidence of human sacrifice or abduction, or something his rational mind refused to name. Then the darkness moved. It didn't swallow the light or fill the space. It moved, it shifted, it became shapes. Robert saw them with his eyes closed, saw them when he opened his eyes, saw them regardless of whether light existed, because they were not absence of light but something else, something that existed adjacent to normal perception. The shadow figures rose from the cave floor, formed from nothing, humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, limbs that bent at too many joints. They had no faces, no features, just the suggestion of heads and eyes and mouths where details should exist. Robert tried to run. His legs wouldn't respond. Paralysis locked his muscles, the same response people describe during sleep paralysis. But he was awake, fully conscious, unable to move while the shadow figures surrounded him. They touched him. Their contact felt like cold, like pressure, like fingers made of ice water pressing into his skin. Where they touched, sensation vanished, not numbness, but absence, as if those parts of his body ceased to exist. Robert tried to scream. His voice wouldn't work. One shadow figure leaned close, its featureless face inches from Robert's, and it spoke. The voice came from inside his head, bypassed his ears completely, vibrated directly in his skull. "You see us now. You cannot unsee. You are marked." Other voices joined it, overlapping, a chorus of whispers. The unbeliever sees, the skeptic knows, the rational mind breaks, the shadow takes. "We have waited. We have called. 4 came before. 4 were prepared. You are 5. 5 completes the circle. 5 opens the door." Robert's paralysis broke. He staggered backward, crashed into the cave wall, his hands finding purchase on stone. The shadow figures didn't pursue. They remained in the cave's center, swaying, their forms rippling like fabric in wind that didn't exist. He ran, out of the cave, down the canyon, his feet slipping on stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him he heard nothing. No footsteps, no pursuit, but the feeling of being followed, of being watched, pressed against his back like physical weight. Robert emerged from the canyon onto the South Rim Trail and nearly collided with another person. He stumbled, caught himself, looked up, and saw Connor Burke. Connor stood on the trail, wearing the same clothes from his missing person photo: green shirt, khaki pants, hiking boots. He looked healthy, uninjured, calm. He smiled at Robert, and his eyes were wrong, pupils too large, reflecting light like an animal's. "Ranger Fitzgerald," Connor said, his voice perfectly normal. "I've been waiting for you." Robert's training reasserted itself. "Connor Burke? Your family is looking for you. Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" "I'm not injured," Connor said. "I'm enlightened. They showed me. The shadows showed me what exists beyond the light. Do you want to see?" "Connor, you've been missing for 2 days. You need medical attention. Come with me back to the station." Connor's smile widened. "I haven't been missing. I've been here, with them, learning. They've been waiting for someone like you, someone who doesn't believe, so that when you see, when you know, your testimony will be undeniable. You're a scientist. You document evidence. They want you to document them." Robert pulled his radio from his belt. Dead. He tried his backup radio. Also dead. Every electronic device he carried had been systematically disabled. "They don't like technology," Connor said. "Technology is light, electricity, energy. They are absence. They consume. You can't call for help. No one can hear you. We're alone here, and they're waiting." "Who's waiting?" "Connor, who are you talking about?" Connor gestured toward the canyon. "The Order of the Empty Dark. They've been working here for 30 years, conducting the rituals, making the offerings, thinning the barrier between our world and theirs. The shadow people are real, Ranger Fitzgerald. They exist in the spaces between light and dark, between matter and void. The Order worships them, feeds them, and in exchange the shadows grant power, the ability to move unseen, to exist in multiple places, to transcend physical form." Robert backed away, his hand moving to his bear spray. "Connor, you're experiencing a mental health crisis. Let me help you." "I don't need help," Connor said, and his voice changed, deepened, multiplied, as if several people spoke simultaneously from his mouth. "I need completion. 4 others came before me. The Order took them, prepared them, offered them. But the ritual requires 5. 5 points for the pentagram. 5 sacrifices to open the door fully. You're the 5th, Ranger Fitzgerald. You were always meant to be the 5th. Connor stepped forward and his shadow moved first, extending ahead of his body, reaching for Robert like a living thing. Robert sprayed the bear spray directly at Connor's face. The capsaicin stream passed through Connor without effect, and Connor kept walking, his shadow wrapping around Robert's legs, climbing up his body. Cold and wrong and impossible, Robert turned and ran upslope, toward the South Rim parking area where his truck waited, where civilization existed, where rational reality still operated. His legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if he was running through water. The shadow clung to him, weighing him down, and more shadows emerged from the rocks around him, forming shapes that matched his peripheral vision, that disappeared when he looked directly at them. He burst onto the South Rim parking area and stopped. 5 vehicles were parked there, his NPS truck and 4 others. Standing beside the vehicles were people in dark robes, faces hidden by hoods, and Robert recognized this scene from the cave paintings. Robed figures arranged in a circle, conducting a ritual. They turned toward him in unison. One figure lowered her hood and Robert recognized her. Sandra Martinez, the chief ranger, his boss, the person who'd sent him on this search. She smiled. "You performed exactly as predicted," Sandra said. We tracked your route, disabled your electronics remotely, guided you to the cave. The shadows wanted a skeptic, someone whose testimony would carry weight. You're perfect." Robert pulled his sidearm, a Glock 22, standard NPS issue. He'd never drawn it in the field, never fired it except at the range. His hands shook as he aimed at Sandra. "This is insane. All of you are under arrest. Step away from the vehicles." Sandra laughed. "Arrest us? With what authority? The shadows own this place. They've owned it for decades. Why do you think the Park Service records so many disappearances here? Why do you think the survivors are always incoherent? We thin the barrier, we make the offerings, and the shadows grant us power. I've been Chief Ranger for 12 years, and in that time I've delivered 17 people to the order. No one suspects, no one investigates. Rangers go missing in remote parks all the time." Robert's gun hand wavered. "This isn't possible. Shadow people aren't real. Occult rituals don't work. This is collective delusion." "Is it?" Sandra gestured, and the shadows around Robert became visible. Dozens of them, hundreds, forming from nothing, surrounding him, cutting off escape. "You've seen them. You've felt them. Your rational mind is screaming that this violates natural law, but your senses know the truth. They're real. And tonight, during the new moon, when darkness is complete, we'll complete the ritual. 5 sacrifices, 5 points, and the door will open fully. The shadow people will cross over, will manifest permanently, and those of us who served them will be granted eternal life in their realm." Robert fired. The shot echoed across the desert, and the bullet passed through Sandra's chest without effect, without blood, without impact. She wasn't solid. None of them were solid. They were projections, or illusions, or something his training had no framework to understand. "You can't kill shadows," Sandra said. "You can't fight what has no substance. Put down the gun, Ranger Fitzgerald. Accept your role. You were chosen for a reason." Robert ran. Not toward the vehicles, not toward the trail, into the desert itself, off-trail, into the wilderness where no paths existed. His rational mind had collapsed completely. He was operating on pure survival instinct now, fleeing predators he couldn't fight, seeking shelter that didn't exist. The sun was setting, the horizon burning orange and red, and as darkness fell, the shadows multiplied. They rose from the ground like smoke, formed from the growing darkness, and they all moved toward Robert with unified purpose. He scrambled up a slope, his hands tearing on volcanic rock, his boots slipping on scree. At the top of the slope was a peak, exposed, nowhere to hide. Robert reached the summit and stopped. Below him, in all directions, the shadows were converging, hundreds of them, thousands flowing upslope like a dark tide. Robert's phone, dead since morning, suddenly vibrated. He pulled it from his pack, saw the screen glowing impossibly, showing a single notification, a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "The copper circle in the cave. Stand inside it. They cannot cross copper. Hurry." Robert looked down at the advancing shadows, looked at his phone's glowing screen. This could be the order, luring him back to the cave. This could be another trap. But the shadows were 30 seconds from reaching him, and he had no other options. He ran, down the slope, back toward the canyon, his flashlight miraculously working now, illuminating the path. The shadows pursued, faster now, their form solid enough to block the starlight. Robert reached the canyon entrance, plunged into darkness, his flashlight beam bouncing off painted walls. The cave entrance appeared ahead. Robert dove inside, his light finding the altar and, yes, scratched into the stone floor, partially hidden by centuries of dust, a copper circle, green with patina, embedded in the rock. He scrambled into the circle and turned. The shadows stopped at the threshold. They pressed against an invisible barrier, their forms rippling, reaching, but unable to cross. Behind them, the robed figures appeared. Sandra and 4 others, all of them gliding instead of walking, all of them wrong in ways Robert's eyes couldn't focus on. "Clever," Sandra said. "You found the old protections. The copper circles were placed by someone who fought us before, someone who understood the shadow's weaknesses. But copper only works if you believe in it. And you're a skeptic, Ranger Fitzgerald. How long will your disbelief hold against what you've seen? Robert's phone vibrated again. Another message. The ritual requires your consent. They need you to walk out willingly. Don't leave the circle. Help is coming. Who are you? Robert typed back. The response came immediately. Someone who escaped. Someone who's been fighting the Order for 8 years. Hold your position. I'm 15 minutes away with proof that will destroy them. Sandra smiled. Whoever's texting you is lying. There is no escape from the shadows. There is no help. You're alone, surrounded, and when dawn comes, when you're exhausted and desperate, you'll walk out of that circle and complete the ritual. But Robert wasn't alone. As the night deepened, he heard engines, multiple vehicles, heavy trucks approaching from the south. Lights appeared on the canyon rim, spotlights sweeping the darkness. A voice amplified through a bullhorn. Federal agents, everyone on the ground now. The robed figures scattered, their forms dissolving into shadows that fled into the rocks. Sandra stood her ground, her face twisting with rage. You've delayed us, but we'll complete the ritual eventually, we always do. The shadows are patient, they've waited centuries. They'll wait longer. She dissolved, her form fragmenting into darkness, and the shadows retreated, flowing away from the cave like water draining. Robert remained in the copper circle until actual humans, FBI agents in tactical gear, real people with real equipment, entered the cave and confirmed it was safe. They pulled him out, wrapped him in a thermal blanket, and the person who'd texted him stepped forward. Her name was Dr. Elena Rodriguez. She'd been a ranger at Big Bend from 2005 to 2007, until the Order had targeted her for recruitment. She'd escaped, barely, and had spent the past 8 years gathering evidence, documenting the cult's activities, building a case that law enforcement couldn't ignore. The text messages had been her, tracking Robert's phone when the Order disabled it, using technology the shadows couldn't interfere with, because it was designed specifically to resist their influence. The FBI arrested 12 people that night: Sandra Martinez, 3 other rangers, 4 park volunteers, 2 local guides, and 3 tourists who'd been recruited into the Order. They found evidence of 23 deaths over 12 years, ritual components, recordings of ceremonies. The case made national news for 3 days before being suppressed by federal order. Too many questions about phenomena that couldn't be explained. Too much evidence of supernatural activity that violated official reality. Connor Burke was found 2 weeks later, alive in a hospital in Mexico. He had no memory of his time missing, no memory of meeting Robert. The drawings in his tent were analyzed and attributed to psychological break induced by environmental stressors. His family took him home to Austin. He never returned to Big Bend. Robert Fitzgerald resigned from the National Park Service 3 months after the incident. The official record showed he'd been involved in a successful operation to dismantle a violent cult, and he was offered commendations. He declined. He moved to Portland, took a job teaching high school biology, and stopped going outdoors entirely. But he still saw them, the shadow people. Every evening as the sun set, every night in his apartment, they appeared at the edges of his vision, watching, waiting, never approaching, but never leaving. Dr. Rodriguez told him this was normal, that once someone had been marked by the shadows, the connection was permanent. She gave him copper bracelets to wear, taught him protection rituals he would have dismissed as nonsense before the incident, and told him he'd learn to live with them eventually. Robert doubted that, because every night when he closed his eyes, he saw Sandra Martinez's face, saw her smile as she told him the ritual would be completed eventually. The Order had been dismantled, but the shadows remained. They existed in darkness, in the spaces between light and matter, and they were patient. They'd waited centuries for the door to open fully. They could wait longer, and sometimes on new moons when darkness was complete, Robert woke in his Portland apartment to find his bedroom filled with shadow figures, pressed against his walls, covering his ceiling, all of them watching, all of them waiting for the moment when his skepticism would finally collapse, when his rational mind would accept that fighting the inevitable was useless, when he would walk to Big Bend National Park on his own, find the cave, step outside the copper circle, and complete what he'd interrupted. Because the ritual still required 5. 4 had been prepared. Connor had been released. Robert was marked. And the shadows always collected what they were owed. Always. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.